Good morning, and welcome to the second day of Codegarden. And we'll have a talk by Elad Schecter, who's the CSS architect at Appright, and who'll be doing his talk on how CSS works. So without further ado, give it up for Elad Schecter, people.
When we starting to learn CSS, everyone explained us that the basic styles that we are seeing in the browser, those styles that you see even before you're writing one single line of code in your own CSS, like the bullets, like the H1, H2, H3 elements that have big font size and font weight, they are coming from the user agent style sheet. And the user agent style sheet, it's kind of the guide of CSS that creates us all the basic style in the browser. Or isn't it? When we are doing inspect element for a div element, we can really see that this div, by default, getting the display property with a value of block, that it's really coming from the user agent style sheet. But when we are doing the same thing for a span HTML element, we are not seeing here any style. Everyone knows that by default, the span HTML element have the display property with a value of inline. But the question here is why? Why we are not seeing this style when we are doing inspect element for a span HTML element? This is a really interesting question, but to answer you this question, I need to talk with you about something else. In CSS, we have 4 global CSS Reset keyword values. We can use those values for any property in CSS. And yes, I'm talking about the inherit value, initial value, the unset value, and the revert value. And let's start to talk about over them. Let's start with the first value, inherit value. Like its name, it can do for us inheritance. And how it really works, let's see a small example on CodePen. Here on this div element, div with a class of box, I give it some style. I give it border, background color, width, height, and some margin. But for all the inner div element, what I'm giving them the same property with the inherit keyword. In this way, they are inheriting the style of the div with a class of box. Cute, interesting. Now let's continue to the second value, the initial value. Every property in CSS has only one initial value. For the padding property, the initial value is 0. For the margin property, it's 0 as well. For the position property, the initial value is static. This is also mean that if you are using the initial value on the padding property, it will be equal to 0. The initial value on the margin property will be equal to 0 as well. And the initial value on the position property will be equal to static. But this, you already know. But the question that I want to ask you now, what will happen if you are using the initial value on the display property on a div element? And maybe you are thinking that you know this answer, because I already told you that div, by default, have the display property with a value of block that is coming from the user agent style sheet. And maybe you are thinking that in this case, the initial value will be block. Wrong answer. When you are using the initial value on the display property, it doesn't care on which element you are putting it on. It's just looking on the property itself. And every property in CSS has only one initial value. For the display property, the initial value will be inline, and it will be always inline. It doesn't matter if you are putting it on div, span, table, or any HTML element that exists. And if you want to know what is the initial value of every one of the property, the best way is, of course, to search it on MDN. This is the example for the display property of an MDN. And under the category of initial value, you can really see that the initial value for the display property is inline. Remember, any property in CSS has only one initial value. And this is bring us back from where we are getting the basic style in the web browser. We actually have 2 levels of style. Think about it. First, we have all the initial value of all the property. Every property in CSS has initial value, and this is the first level from where we are getting the basic style. But then we are getting the second level of style. In this second level of style, it's calling the user agent style sheet. This is creating some special style for special HTML elements. And this is kind of bring us back why when we are doing inspect element for a div element, we see this display with a value of block from the user agent style sheet. Because if you are thinking about it, I know that it sounds crazy, but the display with a value of block is a special style for the div element. Yes, it's a special style, because the default of the display property is inline. And this is also the reason why we are not seeing here any style when you are doing inspect element for span, because the display property with initial value is inline. You don't need to write here all the initial value. Think about it. You have 500 properties in CSS. You don't want to see all the 500 properties every time that you are doing inspect element for span HTML element. And this is the reason why we are not seeing here anything. And now, if you want to know what are the special styles for all the special elements that exist, you can take a look on the user agent style sheet. This is a small part from the user agent style sheet of Chrome. You have here a link if you want to see the full of it, all the special style for the special HTML element. And as you can see here, there are elements that by default you don't see in the browser, like the script element, the style element. And the reason that you are not seeing them, because in the user agent style sheet file, it's declared with display with a value of none. And think about it, that if you want to change it, you can write here, override it, and write display block. This way, you can write code and see it in the browser. And the body HTML element has the display property with a value block, but it has the margin of 8 pixels that we as a web developer really hate. And what we are doing to remove it, we're using Css Normalize or Css Reset. And Css Normalize and CSS, they are kind of creating our own control in the browser style. Everyone is fighting which method is better to use, Css Normalize or Css Reset. But in my perspective, I prefer to use both of them. First, because the Css Normalize is really important. Even if you prefer the Css Reset methodology, Css Normalize is taking care about shadow DOM element. How can you know that what is the shadow DOM element in the Css Normalize? It's also special pseudo classes that you can see with WebKit or stuff like that. This is an inner element that Css Reset doesn't even try to take care. Css Normalize is to solve problem between different visual in the web browser. We have Safari, Chrome, and Firefox, and we want that all of them will be the same. And Css Normalize try to solve this problem. But in most of the cases, you don't want to get some of the style that you are getting from the user agent style sheet. I don't like to get all this H1, H2 font sizes, font weight. I want to declare it by myself. And for that, you can create your own custom CSS reset. You can use another CSS reset from the web. But this is a way why to use CSS reset and to use CSS Normalize combined. And now let's continue to the third value. Remember, we are talking about the global CSS reset keyword. We talk about the inherit value, the initial value. And now let's start to talk about the unset value. And the unset value is working in a really special way, because the unset value sometimes behaving like inherit value if you are putting it on property that does have inheritance by default, and it acts like initial value if you are putting it on element that doesn't have inherit by default. And maybe you are saying to yourself, what you just saying to us? What does it mean? The unset value is sometimes behaving like inherit, and another time is behaving like unset. What does it mean? For that, we need to talk about something really basic in CSS that web developer not even looking on it. In CSS, we have two groups of properties. First group is the inherit properties, and the second group is the uninherit properties. And let's talk about this both group. The first group of properties is the inherit properties. And in this group, we have all the properties of typography properties that we are using for text. Think about it, that if you are giving a container color of text, font size, font weight, line height, text shader, it's always affecting the inner element. But why it's doing it? It's doing it because those properties by default are behaving with inherited. And if you want to know which property has this behavior of inheriting, again, you can look at MDN. This is an example from the font size property, and under the category of inherited, you can really see here the value of yes. And the second group of properties, all the property that does not have inherited by default. This is the uninherited properties. In this group, we have all the other properties in CSS. All the box model properties like padding, border, margin, CSS position, display, like flexbox and grid, transform animation, and many, many, many more. If you want to be sure that a property does not have inherited by default, you can search on MDN under the category of inherited, and you can see the value of no. And this is bringing us back to the unset value, how it's behaved. The unset value, if you are putting it on a property, like typography property of color of text, this property has inherited by default. Because of that, in this case, the unset will behave like inherit. And if you are using the unset value on a padding property that doesn't have inherit by default, in this case, it will act exactly like the initial value. And maybe you're asking to yourself, if the unset value sometimes behaving like initial and another time is behaving like inherit, why not just to use instead the initial or the inherit value? Why I need another value that sometimes behaving like initial and another time is behaving like inherit? We kind of having two good reasons why to use the unset value. Think about when you are resetting a typography property like color of text. You will always want to reset it to inherit. All the other properties, you will always want to reset them to initial. If you are putting the unset value, it will choose for you automatically. But still, this is not the best reason why to use it. And when we have another special reason to use it, and this is for one of the most special property in CSS. A lot of web developer doesn't know that even it exists. I'm talking about the all property. And the all property is like to combine all the property that exist in CSS to one property. And in this way, you can reset all the property in CSS combined with one definition, all and unset. And if you have a container that you want to reset all the inner element, you can create a class name on the container that selecting all the elements with the star selector. And instead of going one by one and resetting them, let's say with font size inherit, font weight inherit, and so on, and all the other uninherit properties, border width with initial, background color with initial, you can write just all unset. This is resetting all the elements inside the container with one definition. And this is a lot better way to do all those CSS reset stuff. But now you need to ask yourself another question. When we are resetting a div element, the display property, if we will use the initial value, it will be equal to inline. But we don't want to reset the display property for a div that it will be equal to inline. And if you are using the unset value, it's acting like initial and will be equal to inline as well. But wait a minute, we cannot reset the display property that it will get the user agent style sheet with the value of block? Of course we can. And for that, we have our last fourth value, the revert value. And the revert value is working in the most special way. The revert value, if you are putting it on the display property of a div element, it's first searching if this div element have some special user agent style sheet for the specific property. And if it has, the revert value will take the value from the user agent style sheet. If it's for the display property, it's used here the block value. But now you need to ask yourself another question. What will happen if you are using the revert value on a property of a specific element that doesn't get any specific user agent style sheet? In this case, it will act exactly like the unset value. For example, if I'm putting the revert value on the font size property on the div element, the font size is not defined in the div element in the user agent style sheet. In this way, it's acting like unset. This is inherit property, and because of that, it will be equal to inherit. If I'm putting the revert value on the padding property that doesn't have inherit by default and doesn't have any style here, it will act like unset, and unset in an uninherit property will be equal to initial. And this is a nice thing to understand how all those basic things are working in the web browser, but maybe you're asking yourself, Why I need to know all those basic things that I can control the basic thing in the browser? What in my day-to-day job I can use all those features? First, maybe in April Fool Day, you can play with one of the web developers in your own company. You can put in the CSS Reset this small code. This is selecting all the elements and all the property, and you can change all of them to be inherit. What will happen then? If let's say, the full stack developer that you want to play with is putting a border for a container, all the inner element getting border. Nothing is work the same. It doesn't work how it's supposed to work, and sometimes it's fun to do some nonsense in your own job. But now let's continue to a more good use case to use it in the day-to-day job. Let's talk about checkboxes and Web Designer. Web Designer hate those checkboxes. They really hate them, and they want them to look beautiful like this thing. And we, as the web developer, that thinking that we are using smart features and we know how to solve this thing, what we are doing, we're wrapping the checkbox with a label element. Then we are adding another element after the checkbox, like a div. And the checkbox, we are hiding it. And if it checks, go to the sibling element and do things like that. Don't use this hacky method. And you can do it with a native way, because now you can give the old property and the unset value for a checkbox. What that it's doing, it's kind of deleting all the style of the browser. When you are doing this thing, you don't see the checkbox. It has a width and height of 0 pixel. Background color transparent. You cannot see it. You cannot click on it. And even if you could click on it, you cannot know if it's checked or unchecked. But then you can create your own customized styles. And for that, let's see a small example. In this code pen, as you can see here in the HTML part, I have only one element, and this is a checkbox element. And this is the native checkbox, only that it's being designed, okay? A native checkbox. And how I'm doing it? First, as I told you, I'm just deleting all the style, all unset, just deleting all the style. And then I'm starting to create my own customized style. But wait a minute, how I'm creating this button inside the checkbox? Really easy, I'm just using the before pseudo element. But how it's being moved when it's being checked? Really easy, I'm just using the check pseudo class that when it's checked, the before pseudo element is moving with the transform property. And in this way, you can design the over, focus, disable state, which state that you want to design in a really easy way. And if you want to believe me that this is a real checkbox, the only thing that I need to do is just to delete the style here, and you will see that it's a native checkbox. Let's see it here. And if I will bring back the style, you can see the animation with the transition, a native checkbox. Nice. The second thing that I understand that all those features are kind of helping us to create a better future for CSS Reset. Until not long ago, or maybe until now, a lot of web developers still using the CSS Reset of Eric Meyer, this huge, big CSS selector that I don't like. And what is so bad with this huge CSS selector, you may ask? When you are doing inspect element in your own project, every inspect element that you are doing, you're seeing this huge selector, and you are losing your mind because you're seeing the things that you don't need to see. It's too much information in the inspector element, and it's hard to debug your own code. And the first thing that I understand when I saw all those new features, that this is a new feature to help us to create a better CSS reset. And the first idea that I had in my mind, that this is how the CSS reset need to look like. Just select all the elements, just delete all the style that we are getting from the user agent style sheet, and because the display property is so important, I just need to revert it, that the div will be display block, table will be display table, and so on and so on. But this didn't work as I expected, and I started to create my own new CSS reset. I called it the new CSS reset. And most of the elements I'm resetting, but some of them I'm not. And I added some more features that I thought are really important to put in CSS reset. And in the end, I published this project on GitHub. And when you are publishing projects on GitHub, web developer finds bugs. But this is a good thing, because they are helping you to solve all the bugs. And in the end, I kind of created my own new future CSS reset that I started to use in my own current project. And this project is really quite successing. It has, I think now it has something like 4,000 downloads per week. It has more than 1,002 GitHub star. And if you want to see the project, of course, you can find it on GitHub. You can see my interview in CSS Tricks, a full article on Medium. And even if you don't want to use it, keep in your mind, you can customize any HTML element that you want. You don't have to use my own CSS reset. You can use, as I show you, the checkbox that we are creating it in any way that you want. And before we finish, my friend, I'm Elad Shechter. I'm a CSS HTML architect at Upright, which is an open source Firebase alternative. And if you want to see more of the featured stuff that I'm doing, because I'm doing a lot of public stuff on CSS, the best place to follow me is via my Twitter. You can see all my other stuff in my own website. And if you want the slide, here is the QR code. You can use your smartphone. And thank you very much for listening.